Welcome back to Face the Nation. We're joined now by CBS News business analyst Jill Schlesinger. She's in Southampton, New York this morning. Jill, Senator Ted Cruz described tariffs and the threat thereof as leverage. But what I'm curious about economically is, do retailers view it as only leverage? Do consumers view it only as leverage? Or are they beginning to change their behavior in anticipation?
Well, let's just talk about whether or not they're going to change their behavior. We know that there were some retailers who were sort of dangling this out around this holiday weekend, saying, oh, buy now because tariffs could make prices go up. I don't know what the motivation of most people is when they shop, but I'm not sure it's tariffs. What we do know about tariffs is, remember, this is a fee that is imposed on an imported good. The importing company, the U.S. company that takes that good in, has to make a decision in that moment. And that company has to decide, are we going to eat it and maybe make less money this year? Or are we going to pass it along to consumers? So that is why consumers are a little unnerved by this, and businesses are as well, because they're not really sure whether they can pass that along and have consumers pay that additional price. What we know is over the long term, in history, tariffs tend to increase the price of certain goods. It's not necessarily across the board, but you know, it is hard coming off of what we've just come through in the last few years with this inflationary spike to imagine that consumers are just going to take it in stride. It is a real hard thing to imagine that any company or consumer is going to feel like they want to absorb higher prices at this point.
Jill, there was a tariff story in the first Trump administration. Do you foresee a deeper and different tariff story potentially in Trump 2.0?
Well, I think there's two parts of that question, which is we don't know what these tariffs are. And as Senator Cruz said, this is a negotiation. So we don't know where we're going to land in that negotiation. But a big difference between where we are today and where we were back in 2017 and 2018 is during the early Trump administration, what we had was incredibly low inflation. That was after the financial crisis. For all those years, inflation or prices only grew by about less than 2% a year. Now, compare that with where we are now. We had inflation spike at a 40-year high of 9% in the summer of 2022. Yes, that inflation rate has come down, but prices are still about 22, 23% higher than they were just 4 or 5 years ago. So the big difference between the first Trump administration and the second Trump administration is prices are already high, and there are many Americans who are struggling. So I think that that is the real fear among economists that I speak to. They're worried that this is going to cause a real anxiety among consumers, and that consumers might pull back at a time where the economy is doing pretty well.
Talking about the economy doing well, you crunch a lot of numbers for us, Jill, and always break them down so easily for our audience. When you look at the data, what's the best news you see and what's the most worrisome sign?
Well, the best news is that the labor market has grown really substantially and has kept up. So I think that the labor market has been the driver of this economy, and it's been pretty consistent. The other part of the good news story is that the United States economy, more than any other developed nation, has come out of the COVID era and that post-COVID inflationary spike much stronger in a growth mode. So we are seeing really good things from the labor market. We're seeing things in the economy. We're seeing that AI and technology is really in a boom period. These are all wonderful things. So what's the downside here? I hate to be a killjoy, but why not? I play one on Sunday mornings. And what I can see is that these tariffs could cause a problem for a lot of consumers who are already struggling. And also this idea that we are going to see the extension of the tax cuts from the first Trump administration in the individual tax code. There is a fear among some investors that while we may not have a crisis right now when it comes to the debt and the deficit, that the extension of those tax cuts could start to really unnerve financial markets. Not happened yet, but those are the two worrisome things, the tariffs and the debt and the deficit. I think those are the two looming things. And of course, all the things we can't contemplate right now.
The three stock indexes have gone up pretty regularly since Election Day. Is that a methodical and well thought out reaction to an election, or a kind of exuberance that may soon run its course?
Time will tell. I think that the initial investor reaction was a second Trump presidency would mean a drop in the tax rates or the extension of the tax cuts, and those tax rates would basically be in place for another 4 years. So we'd have low taxes, which is good for especially the wealthier people out there. They love low taxes, and corporate taxes were already enshrined in the code. Okay, so we have taxes staying low. That's a big factor when it comes to investing. The second part is the idea that a Trump administration would have a light regulatory touch. So when you saw that those first few trading days after the election, what went up a lot? The most highly regulated industries. So that could be energy, that could be banking, that could be other areas where you could really need industrial companies where you need a lot of regulatory prominence in the working of your business. Lighter regulatory touch will mean that those businesses will do well. Okay, so is it exuberance or not? Who knows? I can only tell you that as someone who watches markets all the time, when everybody tells me that the sky is clear and the sun is shining and it's rainbows and unicorns, the only thing I can remember is what my father used to say is, well, no one ever rings a bell at the top or at the bottom. So if you're an individual investor, don't count on everything being great. There's going to be a market slide. There is going to be a sell-off at some point. Don't count on everything being great all the time. Stick to your game plan and only change that game plan, not when the administration changes, but when your own life changes. That's it.
Breaking it down for us, as always, and beautifully so, Jill Schlesinger. Thanks so very much. And we'll be right back. We are joined now by President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. He is in Newcastle, New Hampshire this morning. Jake, good morning. It's good to see you. The Hamas video release of Edan Alexander, I know the administration regards it as a cruel, propagandistic maneuver, but do you detect anything tactical at all in the timing of the release of this video, Jake?
Well, Major, first, thanks for having me. And as far as this video, it is a cruel reminder of the barbarity and the brutality of Hamas, holding so many innocent people hostage, including Americans, including Edan. We were in touch with Edan's family yesterday. I'll be talking to the families of all of the American hostages, including Edan's family, this week. And I do think that Hamas is feeling the pressure. They're feeling the pressure because one of their main partners in crime here, Hezbollah, has now cut a ceasefire deal. And they thought that Hezbollah would be with them till the end. They're feeling the pressure, of course, because their top leader, Sinwar, has been killed. So they may be looking anew at the possibility of getting a ceasefire and hostage deal, and we are working actively with all of the key players in the region, including Israel and Turkey and Qatar and Egypt, to try to bring that about.
The fate of the hostages, of course, on the administration's mind, on the minds of all Americans and all in the region, but also, Jake, I'm sure you saw over the last couple of days the video from Gaza of Palestinians surging to try to get a loaf of bread, in some cases crushing one another unintentionally. All suggestions are that the humanitarian situation there is, if it already isn't past crisis stage, near famine crisis stage. How much does that intensify the need to get this thing across, as you just said, the finish line?
The humanitarian situation in Gaza is a crisis. You have too many people who are suffering from shortages of food, water, medicine, access to sanitation, innocent people who deserve a measure of peace and deserve access to all of those life-saving supplies in abundance. The United States has been working week in, week out, month in, month out, to open crossings, to move trucks, to ensure that humanitarian aid gets in. And at critical moments, we have been able to intervene in ways that have staved off the worst case scenarios of famine. But it's constantly stalking Gaza. And so more needs to be done to get aid in. Now, part of the problem, as we've seen just in the last 24 hours, is not actually moving aid from outside Gaza into Gaza, but moving it around Gaza once it's inside. The UN, in fact, said it was suspending movement from certain areas of Gaza because of concerns about looting. These are all things that would be helped if there were a ceasefire in place.
Jake, is the probability of a ceasefire enhanced or undercut when someone such as South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham says President-elect Trump wants a ceasefire before inauguration deal. Does that help you or hurt you?
Look, I think the key actor right now holding the decision on the ceasefire is Hamas. And the key thing motivating Hamas is not American politics or the American presidential transition. It's their determination about whether or not it makes sense for them at this point, after Hezbollah has abandoned them, after their leader has been killed, after their military formations have been degraded, to finally say yes to a ceasefire and hostage deal. That's going to be the telling thing more than anything that's said back here. But I will say this. There has been very good coordination between our team and the incoming team on all of the aspects of the crisis in the Middle East. We felt it was important that we be in touch with them to keep them up to speed on what's happening, because this handoff has got to be smooth. And they, in turn, have reciprocated by being open and transparent and working with us. This is how it should be in a transition. This is what we're going to keep driving for every day that we have left in office.
Jake, I want to have a conversation with you about leverage as regards the Israeli government. I want to play for you something that Maryland Democratic Senator Chris Van Hollen said on this program a week ago. Let's listen.
We've seen this pattern where President Biden makes demands of Prime Minister Netanyahu only to be ignored or slapped down entirely. And then President Biden sends more bombs and more money. That is not an effective use of leverage.
Your response?
First of all, I respect Senator Van Hollen. He knows these issues as well as any person in Washington, and he is passionate about them. But of course, we have a different perspective. We have at various points over the course of this conflict made asks of the Israelis consistent with our values and our interests. Have we gotten everything we've asked for? No. Have we seen a change in Israeli behavior with respect to the movement of humanitarian assistance, with respect to how they conducted certain military operations, including in places like Rafah? Yes, we have. And so we do believe that we've had a constructive engagement with the Israeli government and also been able to make a difference on the ground with respect to the flow of humanitarian aid. In addition, we worked closely with the Israeli government to bring about a ceasefire in Lebanon, a ceasefire people said wasn't possible until a new administration took office.
Jake, I want to turn your attention to Ukraine, where the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky appeared to indicate in a recent interview that he could possibly be open to a peace settlement in which Russia retains the territory it has. Ukraine, meaning Kyiv, keeps all the rest if that is swiftly brought under the umbrella of NATO. Is that the outline or the contours of something you believe, or the administration believes, could be workable?
Well, Major, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I can't negotiate in public on your program, and I certainly can't negotiate on behalf of President Zelensky, who really should speak for himself when it comes to the destiny of his country. The future of Ukraine should be determined at the negotiating table by decisions of the Ukrainians, not imposed from the outside by the United States or anybody else. I will say, though, that we have been engaging with Ukrainians over the course of this year on how you marry the support we provided them for use on the battlefield with a diplomatic strategy for the negotiating table.
And some recent decisions from the administration have been criticized by Republicans as setting the situation on fire, meaning ATACMS and anti-personnel mines. Those advocates for Ukraine say those decisions are way too late to change the battle space in any strategically important way. Where do you come down?
Anti-personnel landmines, which are non-persistent mines that shut off after 2 weeks, so they don't represent a long-term threat to civilians. These could be helpful against the particular type of tactics that the Russian infantry is using right now in eastern Ukraine. So he's sending them. The ATACMS permission into Russian territory, that was a decision he took after Russia escalated by introducing North Korean troops into this war, a foreign army into this war. So that was a responsible, coordinated step that we took with other allies to respond to that provocation, to that escalation by Russia. The president has been clear all along. We are going to give Ukraine the tools it needs. We are also going to do what we can to put them in the best possible position on the battlefield, so they'll be in the best possible position at the negotiating table, and then that this war will ultimately end in diplomacy.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, thanks so much for your time. And we'll be right back with a lot more Face the Nation. Please stay with us. Welcome back. We turn now to author and historian H.W. Brands. He is the Jack S. Blanton Senior Chair at the University of Texas in Austin. And his latest book is America First, Roosevelt versus Lindbergh in the Shadow of War. He joins us this morning from Austin, Texas. H.W., it's great to see you. First of all, what does this America First clash then tell us, if anything, about today and references to America First?
The debate that I describe in the book is whether the United States should enter World War II. Between the time Germany started the war in September of 1939 and the United States entered the war in December of 1941. That was the narrow focus of the debate. The larger question, and the one that persists today, is what do Americans think their country's role in the world ought to be? Should the United States, must the United States take a leading role in the world? Should the United States concern itself in conflicts among other nations that perhaps don't directly address American interests? This was the question then. It's a question we're dealing with again today.
If you could, sketch out briefly Charles Lindbergh's stature at the time this debate with Franklin Delano Roosevelt was engaged.
Lindbergh came to the attention of the American public, indeed to the world public, in 1927 when he flew a solo flight for the first time across the Atlantic Ocean. He became this national hero. He became a world celebrity for accomplishing this great technical feat, but it was also a feat of personal daring. He was a darling of the United States, a darling in other countries. He was decorated by foreign governments. He became an early celebrity in an age when celebrity was first starting to take form. So that was his position as of 1927. His celebrity took a different turn in the early 1930s when his and his wife's infant son was kidnapped and murdered in what then was called the crime of the century, which gave rise to the trial of the century. And so this golden boy all of a sudden had a dark shadow cast across his life. And so he was in some ways this star-crossed hero at that point. He continued to be influential in aeronautical engineering circles. He knew a lot about aircraft, but in the American mind, he was this great celebrity, and many people were surprised, actually, that he did take a leading role in the debate over American policy, because he was not a political figure. He eschewed politics.
And in that debate with Roosevelt, did Roosevelt and his administration regard Charles Lindbergh as a potential political threat? And if so, how did they deal with him?
It's a little bit hard to say. Franklin Roosevelt at some point decided that he wanted to run for a third term. This broke a long-standing informal rule of American politics. And he knew that Republicans were constantly going up to Charles Lindbergh and saying, you could be president, you'd be a great candidate. Lindbergh's father had been a congressman, but Lindbergh took from his father's experience, which turned out badly because of his opposition to American policy during World War I, that he didn't want to have anything to do with politics or politicians. He considered politicians a bunch of liars, people who could not be trusted, and he considered politics this low and sort of mean occupation that he wanted to have nothing to do with.
When this debate began in 1931, Lindbergh was in one place. When it ended in 1941, he was in a different place in the public mind. Some accused him of being a Nazi sympathizer. Some editorialists described him as an anti-Semite. Where do you come down?
The one thing I should say is that everybody who called him an anti-Semite or a Nazi sympathizer had political reasons for doing so, because Lindbergh became the face of opposition to American intervention in the war. And it served his opponent's purposes to paint him in this negative category. In terms of his Nazi sympathy, there were American Nazis. There was an American Nazi party. They were clearly Nazi sympathizers. Lindbergh was not a member of the party. In fact, the America First Committee, of which Lindbergh was a part, took pains to keep its distance from those. Lindbergh did not want Germany to win the war. His position was that the United States should not place its frontier of security in the middle of Europe, the way Franklin Roosevelt and the interventionists appeared to be doing. But because he took that position, and it was a position that the Germans supported, the Germans didn't want the United States to enter the war, there was this objective sense in which one could say that when Lindbergh gave a speech, it served the purposes of the German government.
How about his appraisal of American Jews wanting to push America into the war and them exercising outsized influence culturally in our country?
So the charges of anti-Semitism against Lindbergh really are associated with a single speech he gave in the autumn of 1941, in which he identified 3 groups that, in his opinion, were most influential in pushing the United States toward war. One was the British government. Britain was already at war, and he explained it was natural that they would try to get the United States involved in the war. The second group, he said, was American Jews. And he said it's perfectly understandable that they should want the United States to get into the war, given what Hitler and the Nazis have done to their relatives, friends, co-religionists in Europe. And the third group was the Roosevelt administration. He was most critical of the Roosevelt administration because Lindbergh claimed that Roosevelt was using the excuse of the war to further his own political ambitions. Now, merely for mentioning American Jews in the context of war policy, the sky fell down upon Lindbergh. Everybody who wanted to make sure that they weren't accused of anti-Semitism, everybody who opposed Lindbergh's policy came down and pointed the finger of anti-Semitism at Lindbergh. To what extent was Lindbergh actually an anti-Semite? Well, I would put him in the category of the sort of not in my country club kind of anti-Semite, which was extremely common in the United States at the time.
Very quickly, HW, there's a clash over information and disinformation. Both sides warn each other and the American public about that. Unspool that for us, if you could, real quick.
The British government and the German government, the two antagonists of the war at that point, were both engaged in propaganda campaigns in the United States. And so when the British government would plant editorials, features in American newspapers, often unknown to the reading public, then Lindbergh and his side would say, well, look what the British government is doing. When the German government would do something similar, then the Roosevelt administration would say, look at what the German government is doing. So each side then, the governments of the two sides, they were doing their best to sway American public opinion because they realized that in the end, it was American public opinion that had to be persuaded.
Foreign interference in American public opinion, then and now. H.W. Brands, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And we'll be right back. That's it for us today. I want to thank you for watching. For Face the Nation, I'm Major Garrett.